Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. As we've talked about a fair amount on the show, gender is at the center of the ideological clashes defining our political moment. Trumpism is, at its heart, a misogynistic movement, and the fractious coalition of philosophies within the Trumpist tent all agree that increased freedom and opportunities for women have been very upsetting for right-wing men. My guest today brings gender into dialogue with the structure of the economy as it has manifested in the developed world. And in doing so, she offers an intriguing challenge to libertarian and radical liberal economic priors. It's one worth engaging with and thinking through. Alysia Ames is a CPA who has spent her career as an accountant in and around government. She lives in Iowa with her husband and two daughters. Her writing can be found on her newsletter, Accounting for Taste. You can find a link for that in the show notes. You can also find her on Blue Sky as @FakeGreekGrill. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to listen to episodes uninterrupted by ads from our sponsors, you can become a supporter. You'll get my newsletter ad-free as well. To learn more, head to www.reimaginingliberty.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Alysia. What is the crank theory of everything?
So it's just the name that I call for just a pattern that I've noticed and an origin theory that I have that's not, no one else seems to talk about or see, but it seems obvious to me. So it's clear that I'm a crank. But basically, for most of history, almost everybody farmed and everyone did farm work, whether you were a man or a woman. There wasn't much of there's separation of duties, but not really separate spheres. Like there was no, like men stayed in the home and worked near the home and everyone was in the fields. And then sort of like, especially after the World Wars, but starting with the Industrial Revolution, more and more people were getting off the farms. And so men left the home and went to work in the office and factories and other places, and sort of left the family. And women were left behind doing all the care labor and the work that keeps family life going. And the modern feminism movement, the second wave, is basically women trying to do what men did first, which is like reap the rewards of liberalism and go out into the world and work for pay, and leave home life behind. But because so much of our society was set up, like especially a lot of things got put into place during those immediate post-war years, there was no one left at home to do the homework, and that's always been the critique of feminism: is who's going to raise the children, who's going to take care of the elderly people, and do all the volunteer PTA work that makes society keep going. And there's not really a good answer for that, and you just see like problems spreading out from that basic premise. That, I mean, like our big state programs are at the state level, it's schools; at the federal level, it's Social Security payments to elderly people; it's Medicaid, it's Medicare. Again, that's care work that needs to be paid for somehow. So that labor is rendered invisible because it exists outside the market. We haven't found a way to internalize it. And because that labor is invisible, it doesn't get seen, or it doesn't have access to the beauty of liberalism or the fruits of liberalism. And it ends up creating this sexist trap for women, or else things fall apart when women aren't there to do it.
So to clarify, to tease out the connection between the women are in this role, and historically have been even more so in this role of domestic caregivers and taking care of that side of thing in a non-market way. They're not earning wages for taking care of the kids. They're not earning wages for cooking and taking care of the house and so on. The connection to that and like the federal programs, how does say having a Department of Education and state public education, which is, of course, the state then taking on the role of providing education to the kids, or giving wages, welfare support, or Social Security support, or these other programs, how does that reinforce or tie into?
Well, it's just the state picking up where the market isn't providing anything, or isn't there's no efficient market valuing the cost of raising children. So it's either going to be done privately in the home, or the biggest state support of it is public education. That's the biggest payment to parents. The biggest contribution of the taxpayer to little kids is the tens of thousands of dollars we spend warehousing them in schools every day and educating them and all that. So if it wasn't for the state picking it up, it'd have to be women doing it for free, or or becoming poor to do it, to pay other people to do it.
And what does this get us as far as analysis? Because I should mention to listeners, I think that the value in this and the value in the conversations you and I have had over the years is I come from my background is in libertarianism and kind of Washington, D.C. style libertarianism. And you have been much more progressive. And I think one of the reasons I've really valued what I've, read of yours over the years and the conversations that we've had over the years is you're very good at pointing out these like kind of blind spots in the libertarian analysis. And I think the crank theory of everything is one of those. And so what blind spot is this pointing out? Like what in the standard story of kind of libertarian market land that I have been talking about for 15 years of my career, what's the thing that I'm missing that this makes me aware of?
I think if you look at who is a libertarian, it's a lot of men. And if you listen to Peter Thiel, who is another proponent of my crank theory of everything, but from the dark side, his hostility towards women is that women don't buy into libertarianism because this amount of work that really is the work that defines womanhood that women have to get done, that forces women into precarity and out of markets, just makes libertarianism very unappealing to them, and liberalism more generally. Like if you want women to buy into markets and to buy into a more free market society, a more free market system of government, you're going to have something besides well, then just don't do it, or well, it was your choice to have children, you should suffer the consequences. And make the way, if you follow liberalism to its conclusion, having children is a very selfish indulgence. It's like a dressage horse or something where you're spending, it's a hobby where you spend all this money and time and resources and are poor for it because you're doing something indulgent, not doing something vital to keep our society going or vital for everything. It's not a fundamental part of being human is raising children. And so to have a very anti childcare, anti elder care bias in libertarianism makes it unappealing to half the population.
Is part of this so libertarianism has a very particular notion of individuality, and often it's characterized by people who disagree with it. In there's the libertarian man or woman is someone who has no social ties, is entirely formed by their own volition and rationality, feels no sense of responsibility to the other humans that he or she shares the planet with, and is motivated by simply an acquisitive nature of getting as much stuff or as much money, which then can turn into as much stuff as one possibly can, with the qualifier that you shouldn't use violence or fraud to get it. There's this very particular picture of that. And it occurs to me as you're talking about this that one of the things that seems like there's a gap in that kind of thinking. And again, I say that's like an overstatement. I've spent most of my professional life among libertarians, and very few of them actually have that kind of picture of people, but there is this rugged individualism angle. Is that there's a lack of appreciation of dependency in it, that we tend to not see that all of us begin our lives dependent, and in a way that's not solvable through market transactions. I would love it if my kids could pay me, but they don't. The babysitting wages don't cut it, and infants are just utterly unproductive. And most of us end our lives dependent on others in a non-market way. And many of us, at various other points in our lives are dependent at some time, but that's not really part of the theorizing. It's not really part of, the libertarians are famously bad about talking about children's rights. Murray Rothbard thought kids were basically like property of their parents, and the parents could do anything to them that wasn't violent, but they had no obligations to support them. And so is that really, is that kind of the gap? Is that essentially women have a liberal society, capitalist society, contemporary Western society has put women into the role of addressing dependence or taking care of those who are dependent, but at the same time, we have kind of written the fact of dependence out of our social theorizing and cultural narratives.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. That it's such a huge part of life, and it's not like I looked at the Libertarian Party's platform on children, and it was like a joke. And I tried to find somewhere someone defending it, and it's just no one took up that mantle. And it's very similar to basically if you're a kid and you don't like your parents, just go find other parents is kind of the gist of it, which is just not how human beings work. And yeah, I think that there's this work that needs to be done that women have been doing, and there's just liberalism doesn't have an answer. And I grew up in a very conservative place, and conservatism has this answer, and it's basically that liberalism can't be for women, that women were meant to be helpmates and dependent, and you find a man and you depend on him, and you and then any dependence you use your time to take care of, and he'll take care of you. So women spend their lives in this state of dependency. And I think libertarians do so well with considering how dependency on government leads to this imbalance of power and the precarity and the danger of depending on government, but not when depending on an individual man, and that the way that makes your life precarious and possibly dangerous. And there's that same power imbalance. And then the power imbalance between children and their parents is also just astronomical, probably the biggest power imbalance that exists. So yeah, it's just this failure of liberalism in general to have a coherent theory of how parenting should be done and how care work should be done. And the only ideology that even thinks about it or that has that coherent theory is the hardcore religious right, keep women in dependency. Liberalism is not for women. They stay behind the scenes, they get the work done, and dependency is their lot. And so I keep saying this sort of thing because I'm hoping someone smart will take up the mantle and have an answer to conservatives when they say well, then who's going to be the housewives, or who's going to be taking care of the children? Who's going to be taking care of the elderly? What, if you can be a working woman, but who's going to get this done? It's still going to be on your plate. And that, there's not a liberal answer for it. And I think that it's just a huge oversight in liberalism, and it gives power to conservatism that I don't want them to have.
It seems like the liberal answer to that, or a liberal answer to that, and I imagine this is an answer that's doesn't satisfy you, but I'd be curious to tease out why, is effectively wealth. Is wealth and the choices that wealth enables. So being rich means, what it means in the abstract, being wealthier, is that you can get more for less, more outputs for fewer inputs. So it takes, I'm wealthier because for every hour I work, I can buy more stuff or do more things than someone who earns less than I do. Or a nation becomes wealthier because it's able to produce more while taking a smaller chunk of its stuff to get there. And so it seems like the liberal answer, or a liberal answer to what you just said, is first choice. So in a liberal society and one that's wealthy, women have more choices about the paths that their lives take. They have more options. They can be, it's easier for them to not be dependent on a man because they can go out in the marketplace and they can earn. And we've talked about this on prior episodes with, say, Samantha Hancock's Lee on, this is one of the things that's really upset right-wing men, is that women are less dependent upon them than they used to be. And they kind of want to engineer the world such that women are dependent on them again, even though men kind of increasingly have little to offer. Lots of men have little to offer to women. But the other part of it is if part of the problem is that women are doing all this work behind the scenes or outside of the marketplace, if you're wealthy, you can pay someone else to do that. You can hire the babysitter to go out more, or you can send your kids to school, or you don't have to do the education and, the homeschooling or one-room schoolhouse kind of thing. You can hire someone to clean your house. Like all of those kinds of traditional roles you can farm out while still having the kids. And that seems to be a way to say, like, yes, this labor is outside of the marketplace, but we could like essentially put it back into the marketplace by enabling people to have enough money to hire someone to do it.
I think the basic problem there is that having children in that case still makes you work worse off even if you're paying someone else rather than doing the work yourself. And I think that that's a distortion of the value of things. So I sort of think like an analogy is like something like air pollution that is external to the market. Obviously, air pollution is bad. There's knock-on effects. It hurts people, and because it's not valued in the market and it's outside of it, there's this distorting effect where people are participating in pollution and using pollution and not paying for it. And I think that when women's work, when care labor, when having kids exists outside the market, then people are not going to be having kids. If you think having kids is a good thing, that having kids should make you better off, that a lot of resources should be devoted to kids, or some resources at least should be devoted to kids, and the market doesn't recognize that, then you have a distorted market that's going to undervalue children and undervalue the work of raising children, which puts, at the very least, children, but realistically also their caretakers in a bad position. And I don't know how much of this is actually an issue, but there's a lot of to do about the global fertility crisis and the decline in fertility around the world, and all these things, trying to think of a cause. But if everyone is moving towards a system of economics that doesn't value children, or that punishes you for having children, and the value of children exists outside of it, then there's going to be a fertility crisis, and there's going to be less children than would be ideal, than would make us all the best off. So there's a real problem in not valuing something that has value.
Can you speak to that question of devaluing having children? Because I think you're right. Like, we do see this, that as countries become wealthier, people have fewer kids. Some of that is more kids survive to adulthood, so you don't need as many to get to that point, which is a unqualified better situation than needing to have a lot of kids because most of them will die before adulthood. But some of it is right, like as a society becomes wealthier, individuals and it can make more choices, people choose not to have kids, or the things that you are told are valuable in that society, or believe are valuable, or in fact are valuable, career success and so on, kids are a cost to that. It is, all of us who have kids know, even if we were working at the time, like, your work suffers. I once told my boss, I had a boss who hired me before I had my first kid. And then when I showed up for work, we'd already had her, and she was like an infant. And I just apologized. I was like, I feel like I sold you like a false bill of sale, because I am like much stupider right now because of sleep deprivation than when you interviewed me. And I hope that gets better. So please bear with me. But there is this move away from having children, or putting them off until much later. Is that bad? I mean, is that like, when you talk about liberalism kind of devaluing children, is that bad, or is that just reflective of, it turns out that a lot of people, when offered the choice, choose not to have kids?
I think it's only bad as so much the choice is being misinformed by a market distortion, that like, it could be that it's just better off. There's only going to be a few kids, and generations will get successively smaller, and that's fine. That's what makes people happiest. But if indeed, like, there is this value to children, if they're good and we need more of them, then that's not being communicated through the market, then that is bad. like, again, just thinking of pollution, like, the ideal amount of pollution is not 0, it's because we're still gonna be living and putting out various gases, but the fact that it's so invisible to the market means that we're not doing anything to limit it, and we're not having the correct amount, um, communicated properly. So if that work is distorted, and I think that it is, then it's not okay, or that we're discouraging people, that the economics discourages people so much from having children.
Can we then try to think through like what the alternative would look like? And I know you'd said that your hope was that someone would come up with an alternative, but like let's talk about that, because I think you're right. There is the hard right trad wife kind of answer to this, which is, you're right, this shouldn't be market activity. Women should be in the home primarily as caregivers. In fact, it is a problem with liberalism that fewer women are stay-at-home moms. That women shouldn't need wages because men, if we just reshore all of the tennis shoe factories, will have wages high enough to support their family again. And there's like an ahistorical angle to this, of that kind of family makeup really only existed for like a couple of decades around the 1950s and is not the historical norm. But we can set the kind of nostalgia for times that never actually existed aside. They offer this story, which is just women stay in the home and you'll be happier and everybody will be better off. That's not at all appealing to lots of people, men and women included. But at the same time, it seems like the right answer is not, because is not that we want to move all of this stuff into the market, or like what that would look like. Like should it be something like, if you're a stay-at-home mom, you basically get welfare payments, even if your husband earns enough that your family's not below the line that would qualify, you get welfare payments, or something like Social Security for women who aren't in the market.
I think it'd be better if you were to support some sort of market, it would have to be the money would go with the children. So it'd be like, whether you're staying home or whatever, it'd be some sort of value of caring for the children. So just having the children in the home, whether you're working and paying someone else to do it or whatever arrangement would work, I think would be the important thing, is making sure the money is tied to what the activity and not just given out. Because I mean, one problem with something like that is that you get your payments to stay home with your kids, and you could either drink all day or spend all day doing carefully planned out activities, and you get the same amount of payment. Um, and again, like, it shouldn't be punished. You shouldn't be trapping women in the home by the creation of a welfare state either. Like, if it's women who get paid to stay home, there'll be a big incentive or social push to be women staying home and forgoing other opportunities and not participating in having their voices heard in other parts of the economy and a world writ large. So I think that's very, very dangerous. But yeah, which it should belong to the kids for sure. And I just sort of like just thinking about, like, fungibility is sort of what, like, if you talk, was it Ross Beard, the libertarian who had the idea about children just choosing different parents or whatever, you belong to
Rothbard.
your kids. Yeah, like um, it's just sort of the way to make the family fungible, I feel like, and that, like, if in a liberal economy, you can go and work for someone, and if it isn't working out and you hate your job or whatever, you go work for someone else, and because of that, your situation gets better. You end up the happiest and most productive you're going to be, and that just does not work for families. Like, having parents that are able to abandon you is bad for children. And I think that the sort of 1950s paradigm where all dad has to contribute is money essentially made dads fungible in that system. And the effect of fungible dads is something social conservatives are always railing about. There's some there. So I don't think that exactly works. I think that if there's a place to start, it's just trying to think of a measurement for the value of caring for children, or to make sure that it's there and showing up in statistics and in, like, I know our ideal libertarian world doesn't have the government, but like right now, when we talk about the government saving money, like, and especially like the like healthcare organizations are very blatant about having family care. Like that's how they're going to save money is they're going to encourage family care, which basically means they're going to find a relative, probably a woman, and she's going to do it for free. And suddenly this money has been saved. But if that's showing up in statistics, in economic statistics and government statistics that women are doing this work and contributing, then it's not going to look as free and not going to be as distorted. You mentioned like the idealized 1950s where like the woman stayed home and the man worked in a formal job earning money somewhere away from the home. And part of the way that's false is that like women weren't spending that much time on childcare back then. They were doing a lot of activities that would be done for money now. Like my grandmothers mostly sewed clothes for their children and cooked every single meal from home and spent a lot more time sourcing ingredients and trying to find a bargain than I ever would. And because, again, that was just off-book work, it looks like they were just, like, sitting home and having fun or whatever. You have this idealized version when the ideal is not true. They were still doing work, and they were still not caring for children. But that myth was allowed to participate because it's just not measured. So just making sure, if there's a way to just make sure and have, like, even just a dummy variable, say, hey, this is here. This is going to increase or decrease. This is how it's affected. That's a start. And then see how things naturally play out from there. And I think that we get like markets are not as natural as we sometimes tend to assume. Like there's a lot of things that are really hard to incorporate into the market. Like there's accounting fights all the time about intellectual property, how to value it. I mentioned like pollution before, depreciation, brand goodwill, like all those things are very difficult and weird. And we end up just using sort of proxy measures to make sure they're on there and there's something that investors can see and that the value is truly being captured. But they're not like, we're not exactly measuring the thing. It's not like a true intrinsic natural thing.
This raises a couple of kind of, as I'm thinking about this from a more libertarian perspective, it raises, I think, some interesting issues. So one is, and this ties back to, I think, your very good point about libertarians being very good at pointing out the problems of dependency on government, but very bad at, say, pointing out the problems of being dependent, of women generally being dependent on men. Even though you could draw a lot of the similar analysis plays out in similar ways. And I think the objection would be, well, but with the government, you're dependent on it in part because it's coercing you to be so. It has laws that are making you dependent, and we can get rid of those laws, and they will. Versus, this is your relationship with government, except in instances where, say, you've emigrated somewhere, is an unchosen one, whereas your relationship to a spouse is voluntary in a way that, although again, we can point to counterexamples where the relationship with the spouse is in fact not voluntary, or the ability to express dissatisfaction in like the standard ways of voice or exit are inaccessible. But there's also like, so if we think about this relationship in that kind of context, market context, there's labor being done that there's not a price on, and there's not the ability to sell this labor, and it's necessary labor, and so it can't participate in market signals about the value of that labor, because markets are a way for us, they're not a perfect one, but they're a way for us to get at like, what is the value of this thing, is basically how much are people willing to give up in order to have it. And if we don't have those market signals, we don't know, and we have to guess at the amount of provision of it. And so we end up with surpluses or shortages. You know, this like kind of standard, the problem with central planning is you take away prices. And so the more we move this labor, and I like your point too about, and I want to highlight it, about a lot of what we do is just kind of saying is just pushing more labor out of the market. Like we'll save money by moving it into this space where it's not market, and then we can't really measure how much of it is happening or what its value is, and therefore we can't know if we're like the trade-off has been worth it. right? Because if we can save money by pushing it out here, that's only worthwhile if we're actually like gaining more in value than that money. But if we've moved it out of a market, we don't have that measure anymore. So that's like, I think that's like that's an interesting way to approach it. But at the same time, what I want to say is there's lots of stuff we undertake that isn't in the market, and that we wouldn't necessarily, we don't object to on similar grounds. There's lots of activities, so if I get together with friends to play a board game, so I bought the board game at some point, but like that's not, none of us are like getting paid. It's not a market activity that we're engaged in when we get together and play a board game, or when you do your hobbies. So you work in the garden. That's labor that you're undertaking, but it's like outside of market transactions. And so maybe it's just that like care of people who are dependent upon us is something that's like outside, it should be outside of market transactions, because you're not like offering up a service that then someone is saying, yes or no, I want this. You're instead like, you brought this person into this world. Now you got to do something with them.
And like, again, that's like, I think the logic of liberalism is that having and rearing children is an expensive hobby. And that's the argument put forward that women need to give up on this hobby if we want equality, essentially. Like just the other day on Blue Sky, Moira Donegan went kind of viral for saying that being a stay-at-home mom is not a feminist choice. And like, that was essentially, and I wrote one of the very few pieces I wrote about the Barbie movie, which again is just very smattered through with this anti-motherhood narrative. And like that's the argument, that it's this expensive hobby. It's the reason for the pay gap. You're just not going to be rich because you're wasting all this time on this your expensive hobby. And I just don't think that's true for children. I think that children are important, and just like you bring someone into this world and you have a big obligation to them. And if you're punished for doing that, for raising the next generation, like what is that going to do for everyone? If there's no next generation, or if the next generation is ill taken care of and not wanted. So I like, that's the logic, but I don't think it's true. I think it's incorrect. And I think that if you want a libertarianism that appeals to more women and isn't just a boys' club, then you have to have something better than that. Then, well, it's the hobby you chose. You're going to be poorer.
Can you speak to this dynamic then, where so you've got like right-wing men telling women to just stay home and have kids, but you also have, as you mentioned, the viral Blue Sky post and the Barbie movie, and I'll link to that article in the show notes, because it's a very good article about that movie. You have this decidedly not right-wing kind of feminist perspective that is, one way to put it is that women who do stay home and have kids, or dedicate their time to unpaid caregiving, there's something either non-voluntary about that choice, or non-admirable about that choice, or that the women who are doing it are somehow victims. That it is, if you had all the resources, if society was not as patriarchal or right-wing or coldly capitalist or whatever, you would choose not to be a mother. That like choosing to be a mother is to some degree a sign of failure. And I'm overstating the argument for kind of clarity's sake, but there is that like vibe that liberation comes from not having kids.
And like, in one sense, it's kind of true in the world we live in. You're going to be, especially women are better off usually when they're not married and don't have children. They're more wealthy and more powerful. But I think that it's just that the feminists developed out of the same world we all did. And there's this bad assumption in there that having children has negative value, isn't something of worth. And even if you're like willing to give like head pats and Hallmark cards about the most important job in the world or whatever, if you're still, the payment of it is dependency and poverty, you don't think it's the most important job in the world. So I think that It's just a bad assumption that's very, very baked in to the way that everything developed, the way that our economy developed and our social politics developed, that feminists have not done a very good job of examining, and are also using the same wrong assumption that like Peter Thiel is using.
So how should we think about that then? If on the one hand you don't want to say to women, and I mean I'm talking like in this moment, right? Because we're in this very gender charged moment where arguably the authoritarian fascism that has taken over the federal government and is represented in Trump is ultimately about gender and upsetness. I point this out a lot, but like Trumpism basically began in Gamergate. It began with men mad that women were playing video games, which they had seen as like their space. So women had come into the treehouse, and then they had the gall to do what is just completely like bog standard feminist media criticism of like the male gaze and the way that women are represented in these games and the sexual politics of them, like that feminist theory's been doing forever. And there's a lot of value in that, but it wasn't like this was like a new assault on anything. It was just women are coming in, playing these games and now talking about them. And they were just livid about this. It was unethical for this to be happening at all. And then that's how we got Trump. I mean, I think you can, like, it sounds oversimplified, but I have increasingly come to believe like that is the story. And that's the genesis of Trumpism, is Gamergate. So how do we think about this, where that like the role of being a mother, the role of having children, where every last bit of it is like politically charged and is this essentially this political football?
One of the everythings that incorporates into my crank theory is that part of like that sort of inchoate male rage that's fueling politics is Gamergate. I don't know if there was Elevator Gate that kind of tore apart the atheist movement, and which was sort of a similar dynamic. And I think that because there's great value and there's a lot of power and different ways that expresses in the feminine role of caretaker, and because it's supposed to be nothing, it's supposed to be worth $0, it's supposed to make you it's supposed to make you dependent, it's supposed to be valueless, but it is valuable. And so men are consistently undervaluing how important family is and taking care of people and being dependent upon is. And so they end up sort of adrift and lost and not as grounded as women, I guess, and not as important to their families as women. As I said, like dads are sort of fungible if they're only contributing money, but care labor is not like that. So I think that if we could, that selling the value of care labor to men and the importance of it, and examining the way that care labor leads to power over children, and like there's the think of the children meme where women are mostly moms trying to exert power over their communities through the use of children. And I know that like the right harps on the anti-nuclear women movement and prohibition as being the fault of moms too, or of women participating in the world. So there is this power that men kind of sense, but they don't really get. And I think that if they could see the power and get some of it for themselves and participate more in caregiving and family life, that our gender politics would be a lot better, and men in particular would be a lot better off if they could see it.
I like that point. I like this idea because we talked a lot, we being the discourse, has talked a lot about, the contemporary moment is like a crisis of meaning for a lot of men, that's what's led them to this. And I think this was the appeal of Jordan Peterson, even though if you look at what he says, it's either like utterly banal advice about cleaning your room and kind of,
it's very mom advice too. Like that's
yeah.
Oh, like
yes,
like verbatim what my mom says. Like
yes, it's exactly that. But then where it tries to go beyond that banal advice, it's just nonsense. It's like pseudo intellectual nonsense. And they're rushing for meaning in. They're trying to find meaning in like, well, if we can just return to these trad lifestyles, I'll have meaning again. If we can just get women to stop playing video games, I'll have meaning again. Or I'm drawn to like trad Catholicism because at least there's an aesthetic vibe to it that feels meaningful. But that ultimately, like, to some degree, it was that men were told their value was as conduits for market activity. I think if I am characterizing, so that the provider father was not a father, he was a provider. And the role that he was playing was to pass money he earned through his market activity along to the mother, who was then the mother and was doing mother things and using this money to support herself. And so his only real value was as kind of a checking account, in a sense. And again, I'm like overstating, but I think this is like one way to think about that relationship. And it gets to the fungibility that I can change checking accounts. I can move to different banks, and it's pretty easy. And I don't feel a deep connection to my bank. And then when men, essentially their earnings compared to women, the economy shifted. Women were earning more. Part of that was like women are going to college more than men, and the economy shifted to something that required like college degrees and service work, which women were more willing to do. That like being the bank account for the family became less viable for a lot of men, because the women could be both. I mean, a lot of them could do both. They could be a mom and be their own bank accounts, or they could just be their own bank accounts in a way that they couldn't have been before. And so, yeah, so I think you're right that part of this is just convincing men that, like, you don't have to be the provider to have meaning, that there are like non-market sources of meaning, which is to some extent what we've been saying is like women have been doing. Like, you can find a great deal of meaning in being a mother.
And like there's a bunch of volunteer activities that kind of spread out from there. I think one just anecdote that is really illustrative of that, the mother issue in men's rights is I think his name is Paul Elam, is this men's rights activist who was much more prominent like 10 years ago. But his like villain origin story was that when he was a kid, his mom forced him to take diarrhea medicine. And like this is what he would tell people too. And like because his mom had that power over him to force him to take diarrhea medicine, then how could you say that feminism is needed because women have this power? And so like I think that and that's just so illustrative that it's like men seeing this power and knowing it's there, but instead of thinking like I should fight for this power, I should fight to be involved here, the way that women or feminists looked at traditionally masculine sources of power, they're like that power is illegitimate, it should be destroyed. So just getting like it's almost like just recognizing that there's value and that it's value that's available for anyone, and that like you won't get cooties from participating in that sort of thing. There's like you can still be masculine at your heart and participate in family life, and there's nothing natural or inevitable about men going to offices. Like it wasn't men going to cave offices while the women stayed home. Like that's a new thing, and men should be fighting for it.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.